The phone in my pocket is nearly 4 years old and it is fine. The same model sits on my shelf in Singapore and I have replaced the shelf version of it twice in that time. I have dropped mine down a stairwell. I have never dropped a shelf one. Nothing dramatic happens to them. They just live a completely different day. I rent real Android handsets out of a room here. Physical Samsung units, a carrier SIM in each one, driven over the network by whoever is paying for it that month. A bit over 100 on the shelf right now. So I have a slow and quite boring sample of how long identical hardware survives when you never let it rest. It is not the number in any review. Why the duty cycle is the whole answer. A phone in a pocket is asleep for most of its life. That is not a figure of speech. It is how Android is built. Deep doze, batched wake-ups, a radio that gets to settle down between checks. A phone in a rack has not been properly asleep since the day it went in. There is nearly always something holding a wake lock on it. An automation app, a session that has to stay live, a monitor asking whether it is still answering. The screen is off, almost nothing else is. Then the charging. Everybody has heard that lithium cells dislike sitting at 100%. In a pocket that costs you very little because the phone is at full for 7 hours overnight and then spends the day coming down. A rack phone sits at full for 2 years. It has to. The entire product is that it answers when somebody logs in at 3 in the morning, so the cell is held near the top of its voltage range every hour of its life, and the room it does that in never really cools down because it is full of other phones doing the same thing, and it never restarts. Uptime on these runs into months, which no consumer phone ever experiences. So a rack month is not a pocket month. I do not have a clean multiplier for you, and anybody who hands you one is guessing. But the order things break in is consistent enough to plan around. The cell is the clock. The battery goes first. It is not close. On my shelf, the honest range is 18 to 24 months before a cell is either visibly swollen or worn far enough that I am pulling it. Some go longer. I had one at 14 months that nobody had ever touched. The part that surprised me is that it is not cycle count doing it. A rack phone barely cycles. It sits at full and trickles. What wears it out is calendar time at high voltage in a warm room, which is a different aging path entirely, and one no review measures, because nobody reviews a phone by leaving it plugged in for 2 years and coming back. So the units with the least use on them are not the youngest units. A phone that sat idle at full charge for 6 months waiting for a customer aged at very nearly the same rate as one that was working the whole time. That was not obvious to me at the start, and it changed how I hold spare stock. What a swollen battery actually costs you. A swollen cell is the one failure that takes the decision away from you. Everything else lets you schedule. It is slow, fine, it goes on a list. A cell that has physically expanded is a fire hazard packed a few centimeters from its neighbors, and it leaves the shelf the same day. You spot it before you measure it. The back cover develops a hairline gap that was not there in January. Or the unit rocks slightly when you set it down flat. And then the fair question, which is why not just replace the battery, since a cell costs a fraction of a handset. The labor is most of the answer. The back is glued, the screen is the expensive part, and it is right there while you work. And the cell you are fitting is a third-party one of unknown provenance that now has to survive 2 more years of the exact conditions that finished the first one. I have done it. It took most of an afternoon, and I did not trust the result afterwards. The rest of the answer is what the swelling tells you. That cell did not expand on its own. It spent 2 years hot and full, and every other component on that board sat in the same conditions for the same 2 years. You are not repairing a phone. You are replacing the part that gave you a visible warning first. The port and the cable, second in the order, and the one nobody expects, is the connection. Every one of these handsets has a USB cable in it permanently. It does not get unplugged for months at a stretch, which sounds gentle and is the opposite. The cable sits in the port under its own weight, the contacts oxidize slowly in a warm room, and what you get eventually is a connection that is intermittent rather than dead. Intermittent is the expensive word in this business. An app deep session that drops once a day. A device that disappears off the fleet list for 90 seconds and then comes back looking perfectly healthy. That reads exactly like a failing handset. And I have burned evenings diagnosing a phone that was completely fine. So cables are a consumable here. They get swapped on a schedule now rather than when they fail, because a cable costs almost nothing and a wrong diagnosis costs a night. When it is genuinely the port and not the cable, that is usually the end of the unit. The port is soldered to the board, and board level repair on a $200 phone is not a business decision. It is a hobby. Storage almost never gets there first. Flash wear is the failure everybody expects to matter, and in my experience it mostly does not get a turn. The wear itself is real enough. These devices write constantly. App state, logs, caches, the streaming stack that puts the screen in your browser. A phone in a pocket writes a fraction of that, but the battery or the calendar usually finishes the unit before the storage does. Across my shelf, bad flash has ended fewer handsets than bad ports have. I have pulled a couple of units that were quietly failing writes and hiding it well. But if you are planning a fleet and lying awake about flash endurance, you are worrying about the fourth thing on the list. The failure that has nothing to do with hardware. Here is the one that actually ends most of my phones, and it is not a fault at all. The vendor stops shipping security patches. The patch level on that device freezes on whatever date that happened, permanently, and it never moves again. Nothing is wrong with the phone. It could be the quickest unit I own, and the cell could be in fine shape. It is simply no longer sellable for the job it was doing, because a lot of apps check that date and treat an old one as a reason to be careful. Add it up over a couple of years, and most of my retirements were never broken phones at all. They were working handsets that ran out of calendar. That is a strange thing to get used to. The instinct is that hardware dies and then you replace it. What mostly happens is that the hardware is fine and you replace it anyway. What the unit has to earn. Now the money, because a lifespan on its own is not a number you can act on. A handset is around $200. A phone rents at $50 a month at list, and out of that 50 comes the carrier SIM, power, rack space in an expensive city, bandwidth, monitoring, and a person who walks to the shelf. So the handset is not the biggest line or close to it. The SIM alone takes a real bite every month, whether or not anybody is logged in. The mistake I made early was thinking in calendar months. A phone that survives 24 months only counts as a 24-month asset if somebody was paying for all 24. What matters is how many of those months it was actually rented. Idle months still cost you. The SIM bill arrives, the power runs, and the cell ages at full charge exactly the same as a busy one. There is no such thing as a phone in storage here. An idle unit spends its life on nothing. So the number I watch is earning months, and it is only loosely connected to lifespan. A unit that lives 20 months and is rented for 18 of them beats a unit that lives 30 and is rented for 15, which reframes the problem. I cannot make the hardware last much longer than it does. The levers I actually have are keeping units filled and not buying stock I have no demand for yet. Why the cheapest handset is a bad deal at any price. This is where people disagree with me, and I am fine with that. Say I can save $40 a unit by going one tier down. Spread over 20 months, that is $2 a month. Against everything else a line costs to run, $2 a month is noise. Now price the other side. If that cheaper unit needs one extra trip to the shelf a year, the saving is gone before the first year is out. And if it is a model I do not already stock, I am carrying 2 spare piles, 2 cable types, and 2 sets of quirks in the setup scripts. So my rule sounds backwards when I say it out loud. I will buy the model I already have at the worst unit price before I buy a different model at a better one. Sameness is worth real money on a shelf. Variety is worth nothing at all to the customer who is looking at an Android screen either way. The exception is when a model I standardized on stops being available. Then the right move is to change once, deliberately as a batch, instead of drifting into a mixed fleet one bargain at a time. What I got wrong about charging. For the first stretch of doing this, I left everything plugged in at 100% and never thought about it. That is the obvious way to run it. The phone should be ready, so keep it topped up. The batch from that period swelled earlier than the batches after I started holding charge lower wherever the software allows it. I want to be careful with that claim. It is not an experiment. Different models, different customers, and no baseline at all, because I was not logging battery health on those first units at all. I started that spreadsheet a year too late, so the 18 to 24-month range I gave you is partly memory. What I can tell you is that I have not gone back. Leaving a rack pinned at full is the default everywhere, and I think it is the wrong default. I would rather be wrong about the mechanism than spend another 2 years running it the old way to prove it. The limit I will own is that I still do not know what the ceiling is. I have never had a handset here die of old age doing nothing. Every one of them either swelled, went intermittent at the port, or ran out of vendor support first. So I have no idea how long the silicon would last if I solved the other three, and I am not going to find out because the vendor calendar gets there before the answer does. If you would rather rent from someone who is already carrying that replacement cycle instead of running the shelf yourself, everything is at cloud.one. Subscribe for more on cloud phones,